Hello, I'm John Feldt, and this is the Blue Water Outlook Weekly Water Briefing, recorded on March 24th, 2013 for the Midwest. Let's start off by taking a look at precipitation over the last 7 days. Definitely the active band was a band that extended from Colorado across parts of Kansas, Missouri, and on east. Pretty significant precipitation over parts of southern Illinois and Indiana, 2 inches or more. And then the snow event, the heavy snow event that started late in the week in Colorado and is currently moving across Missouri and then off to the east. Further north of that region, anywhere north of this line here, it was much lighter in the form of snow and pockets of snow here and there, some heavier and some lighter over the last 7 days. Now, if we look at the percent of normal precipitation over the last 7 days, you see that most of the upper Midwest experienced below normal precipitation. That's the areas of yellow and red, well below normal precipitation in parts of Iowa, and then across that northern tier of Missouri, northern Illinois, Indiana. But also some pockets, hit and miss here, the upper part of the Midwest, some above normal precipitation in North Dakota into northern parts of Minnesota. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of go back over the last 90 days and sort of give you the big picture here as far as precipitation patterns. I'll be looking at this a lot more over the next couple of weeks and months, but right now this is the departure from normal of precipitation over the last 90 days. And areas in blue and green are above normal. So for example, a dark green would be between 1 and 2 inches more precipitation over the last 90 days than normal, and areas of yellow are below normal. So generally speaking, we have sort of a mixed type picture here. First off, a lot of that gray there is saying that most of the winter precipitation was fairly close to normal, and I think that's the main story to tell here. But there was a band from Missouri up across Illinois, sort of the area here, Wisconsin. This was a little bit more significant as above normal precipitation in that region over the last 90 days. Now the Drought Monitor here does show this very distinct band. Now this set up last fall, you might remember. We started getting some improvements over eastern Missouri and Illinois into Indiana, and that trend has really continued right as we've gone through the winter months. There's been a bit of improvement over the Great Plains, but for the most part, the drought still persists across parts of Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and then it gets better in the upper Midwest, far upper Midwest, due to some active snow tracks. But basically, we still need a lot of rain in this region right here. And the winter precipitation, like I said, that normal precipitation has helped a bit, but it's still a long way to go before we get rid of drought conditions or alleviate drought conditions across the upper Midwest. So let's review the current snow depth. This is the current snow depth, and there have been a couple active tracks so far this winter. Usually in winter we get some paths that set up and they can be semi-permanent. And one path was this path right here that went from the eastern part of North Dakota across central and northern Minnesota into Wisconsin, part of Michigan. We had a secondary track that sort of went from Texas up in this region right here. And then currently we have a track sort of moving across this region, but that's just a localized track. The other two tracks were pretty significant. And as far as snow on the ground, that northern track, northernmost track, is definitely the one that has produced the most snow on the ground. I'm going to talk a bit about the Arctic Oscillation. 90% of the winter so far we've been in this negative phase of an Arctic Oscillation. That means that we've kept this snow on the ground, and you can see here in purple, that's over 3 inches, and in some cases over 6 inches of water equivalent of snow on the ground. So that area right now is getting to be quite vulnerable. Now, I think it's somewhat limited in extent this year, but definitely where the water equivalents are high, there is that potential for significant runoff once we begin to melt that snow. Now the snow on the ground here is more modest, but this is welcome to water resource recharge. It'll have a beneficial impact once that melts as well over this region here. It's just not to the point where it would produce flooding, but it would certainly help drought conditions a bit when that begins to melt. So the U.S. spring flood risk came out, and this will be updated from time to time. And this goes along with what I'm saying, is that there is a chance for the more significant precipitation that's on the ground once it melts. This is the area here, and it's sort of aligned along there, along the river basins, drainages, for the most significant flooding this spring. And elsewhere in the upper Midwest, just generally minor flooding. This area has been wet, stream flow is high. That's why the potential is higher in that area. The upper Midwest, that snow cover on the ground, considerations for the outlook. And I will be showing this most of the time in my briefings for the next month as we change this due to either additional rain or snow. Now, I mentioned the Arctic Oscillation. If you listen to my briefings throughout the winter, and might be getting tired of hearing about it, but before long we'll be getting well into spring. You won't be hearing about it for a while. But I did mention that it was forecast to move into a very negative phase. This is neutral right here. You can see it's the most negative phase we've had all winter season so far, and that has brought that pocket of cold air down over the Midwest that has really dominated. And along the edge of the thermal boundaries where you get your precipitation trends and your action. So that's one of the reasons why that precipitation in the form of heavy snow has formed from Colorado across Kansas, Missouri, and on east, right on that thermal boundary due to this tightening and very negative phased Arctic Oscillation. Now the red are ensembles, what the forecast is for the next several weeks. And what you see here is that it is forecast to get back up towards sort of a neutral range, but not until we get into April. So it looks like, late March into April, the end of March. So it looks like for the most part this next week we're going to be in this negative phase and then gradually getting out of that and getting more towards neutral. This is an example of a thermal pattern, temperature pattern during a negative phase Arctic Oscillation. The coldest air is the white and purple, very cold air. That sags south, sags east. And then right along this is the warmer air. Right in this boundary here is oftentimes when you get your more enhanced precipitation. Now in the colder air here, you can have snow. In the warmer air, severe weather, and that's what we've had. Now up in the upper part of it, it's much quieter. So in the upper Midwest, we would expect just basically quiet, cold weather and not as active. But again, along that boundary here, that's where you're going to have your more action. So the big picture this week, well, the blue line is the early week, the yellow is late this week, and as you can see, that blue line is your typical negative phase Arctic Oscillation pattern, cold air spilling well south, the jet stream dipping to the south. Late, it begins to moderate a bit and bows further to the north, but for most of the Midwest, this is that cold, stable pattern, light amount of precipitation. There will be some in the form of snow, but once again, once we get into this, that we're settling in this, it looks like it's going to be a relatively stable pattern, at least this week. The tracks of surface low are over the eastern parts of the Midwest. This is along that boundary I mentioned, and you can see this track early this week could provide some precipitation over eastern parts of the region and then up into the northeast U.S., but no surface low tracks over the upper Midwest. Again, fairly quiet. As far as that track of heavy snow that developed over Colorado, this is some indication of the pockets of heaviest snow from St. Louis on across southern Illinois into Indiana and then further eastward. Of course, I think this area, even though it's not quite as drought-stricken, it can still use that moisture, still store that moisture, could produce some scattered flooding, but I don't think we're at the point quite yet where we would say we don't want additional rain in that area, although it is getting close. It'd be nicer if that was further off to the west, but right now that looks like even that area could use a bit more moisture. So here's the rainfall forecast for the next 7 days. It's most of this comes early this week with that snow event that moves from west to east, but take a note over the upper Midwest here. Maybe some light amounts of snow from time to time, but generally a quiet pattern for the next 7 days. This is a climate model. You won't see this too often on television or elsewhere. It's sort of long-range model, and I wanted to point out anomalies for precipitation week 1 and week 2. This will bring us into early April, and the yellows and reds are negative anomalies, are below normal precipitation. Greens and blues are above normal. So here's this first week, week 1. You can see the Midwest is dominated by orange here, so below normal precipitation in week 1. That'll take us out through the end of March. Week 2, It looks like the Great Lakes and upper Midwest still dry, but here's a possibility of some enhanced precipitation over perhaps South Dakota, Nebraska, into Kansas on week 2, maybe even into parts of western Missouri. So we'll have to see if that comes, the further we go out, not quite as much confidence, but that goes into early April. So this week's takeaway points: heavy snow event that started earlier this weekend will continue and move east along the southern parts of the Midwest. Otherwise, generally a quiet week. And week 2, generally trending quiet for most of the area, but there could be some enhanced precipitation over west and southwest parts of the Midwest. Hey, I'd always like to hear if you enjoy these briefings, if there are things I can do to make them more beneficial to you. You can always reach me with questions at john@bluewateroutlook.com. And if not, I'm working on my newsletter this week. I'll get that out in early April, and I will be updating the weekly Water Outlook again next Sunday. Thank you for listening.